The sauna was humid and heavy because of the heat. The soft fog on the wooden walls, the sound of the stones clattering and the unnatural rhythm. I sat there with my back against the hot panels with my feet folded. I was sweating because of the heat and my skin was a little shiny, and this attracted the attention of my stepson. He had come to the sauna before me and sat opposite me. He must have noticed the tension between us because he kept quiet, but it wasn't the first time we had been in the sauna together, but this time it was different. Still, the way he was looking at me was making me shiver, and my chest was rising and falling rapidly with my deep breaths, revealing the sweat beading on my collarbone, and at that moment he asked me, "Are you okay?" I said softly and playfully, "Yes, I'm fine, it's just a bit hot," and he joked, "That's what saunas are for," and I smiled slightly and leaned forward, and just then my towel slid forward and my stepson's eyes widened and his heart started to race. "You seem pretty quiet today," I said. "Is there something on your mind?" My stepson stammered, confused about how to react and not wanting to give too much information. "I'm just thinking about something in my head," he said, throwing back his wet hair. I leaned back and closed my eyes and said to him, "If you want, you can tell me everything that's on your mind." I said, "Don't forget we have a good communication," and he nodded, but he wasn't sure he heard me. Silence followed, a faint hiss of steam seeping between them. He wanted to say something to me, but it was stuck in his throat. Because he inadvertently saw more of my partially bare skin. "Maybe it's just the heat," he finally murmured, his voice so low that it was almost inaudible. "It feels so good in here though, doesn't it?" I replied immediately. My stepson's breath caught in his throat. "Yes, it does," he said. He was hesitant and wanted to move away from me, so I opened my eyes, looked him in the eye and said, "Come and sit next to me," pointing to the empty seat next to me. He was shocked but didn't show it. He hesitated and stood up, walked the short distance between them and sat next to me, but we were so close that our legs were almost touching. The steamy air mixed with the warmth of his skin gave him more reason to feel alive. Then I threw my head back, naked to the neck, and let out a small sigh. "You know, I think about how much you've grown up. You're not that boy anymore." His throat was practically dry from the heat. Without letting him answer, he continued. "You were always the one I could count on, and you always will be." The silence was back, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a current in the air, something unspoken but common to both of us. Suddenly he said, "I think I'd better go," but he didn't move. It was a normal thing to say, but his gaze wanted him to stay. I turned my head and looked at him. I leaned down with a slight inclination and said, "You can stay if you like." The restraint in my stepson's breath was released. He didn't know what to say, because the closeness of the sauna room, the warmth, the soft glow of the dim light, all seemed to combine to create a vague confusion. Then, as the silence continued, I reached out and my fingers lightly touched my stepson's hand. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice calm. "It feels different," I said, barely above a whisper. "Yes," he agreed, his hand in mine. I stroked his skin gently with my thumb and suddenly he turned his face to look at me. Our faces were so close that there were only a few inches between us. Warmth, intimacy and tension. Without thinking, he leaned forward and our foreheads touched. I went deeper with him and the breath on our lips touched. The steam was hissing and hissing. The sauna was full of whispers but nobody cared at that moment. All we could think about was the distance between us, and suddenly my hand started to travel up his arm and stopped at his neck. I grabbed his neck and my hand was there, warmly touching his skin. It made his body tingle and I could feel it. His body trembled and circulated because of the intimacy between us. He said in a surprised tone that summarized the general situation, but I said, "I know," with a calm breath, and our lips began to touch. Meanwhile, it felt as if time had stopped. The heat in the sauna and the heat between us had overlapped. My lips barely touched hers, but the impact of that contact on hers shocked her body. It wasn't just a kiss. The kiss meant that there was a point of no return. My stepson hesitated for a moment, wondering whether the best approach would be to run away or stay until the end. But his body decided for him. He swallowed, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. "At least not like this," he murmured, his voice deep and gravelly. But before he could utter the words, his body rejected him. My stepson did not retreat, but rather moved to the left, his gaze once again focused on my lips. "I know," I said again, my voice almost drowned out by the faint hiss of the sauna. My stepson's head was still in the palm of my hand and his fingers were twirling in my wet hair. Whatever he wanted to do next, he did it without saying anything, and this time he kissed me with more determination. It had nothing to do with a snap of the lips, it was a kiss forged in longing. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of silence and all the emotions that had been waiting for this very moment between us. And in an instant, without thinking, her hand went to my waist and pulled me to her. The feel of her bare skin set his nerve endings on fire. They kissed again, a little deeper this time, their breath mingling in the sweltering heat. She wrapped her body around him, the towel she was barely holding on to loosening slightly and sliding down. She tilted her neck to the side and kissed his lips as his hands roamed over her waist, and he pecked all over the soft skin of her neck. Each caress made her body tremble. With a soft moan, her fingers moved to his shoulders, her lips began to roam over his body, the tension building with every second. Without thinking, the boy's hand relocated down to her waist, drawing her nearer. The feeling of her bare skin set off the boy's nerve endings. They kissed once again, this time a little deeper, their breaths mingling in the sweltering heat. She wrapped her body onto him, the towel she had on barely hanging on to her skin loosened slightly and began to slide down. As the boy's hands traveled across the woman's waist, the woman tilted her neck sideways and kissed his lips as he pecked her all around the soft skin of her neck. Every caresser made the woman's body quiver. With a light moan, her fingers went to the boy's shoulders, her lips began to travel down the boy's body, the tension decidedly amping up by the second. "Are you sure about this?" asked the boy with an ardent voice, but hesitation still layered beneath. Considering how charged the atmosphere was, some of them were particularly stalwart about the fact that they were still there, situating how they reached this stage. Little Mother inclined her face toward the boy and placed the handy wipes, also known as napkin headwear. "I have never been more certain in my life," he said. She then lowered herself so that there were no interruptions when the boy wanted her to kiss him again. The hunger embedded in the kiss dwelled deep was more pronounced than in the previous kiss. The boy's hands already roamed around the lady's back when they reached the place where the towel was pinned. Without thinking it through, he jerked and the towel fell off, exposing her completely to the boy's gaze. She breathed softly but made no movement to stop him. Instead, she let the towel fall off completely, leaving her vulnerable, and yet the look in her eyes told her she had never felt so in control. Her heart was racing as her hands explored her bare skin. She could barely breathe. She brought herself closer, her body reciprocating her touch. Her movements slow and deliberate as she continued to kiss, as if they had all the time in the world. The warmth of the sound as she seemed to intensify the sensations, every sense of touch magnified. She murmured, "You are so beautiful." Her voice stiffened with emotion. Like her hands, she roamed her body, feeling the curves of her waist and the softness of her skin. She smiled at him, her lips curled in a way that made her heart beat even faster. "You always say the right thing," she teased slightly. But for a moment there was a seriousness in her eyes that was not there before. They merely clasped each other, their foreheads leaning against each other, their breathing coming in short gasps. The sounder was silent save for a soft hissing of steam and the beating of their hearts. It was at this moment that, as he reset his position to be more comfortable, his leg accidentally rubbed against hers, which made her jump. She instinctively answered, pulling her nearer to him. Their bodies were now sandwiched one against another, and the towel that she was barely holding onto folded down even more, and she was left completely bare in the burning heat. Her embarrassment seemed to bother her, but at the same time, she didn't care. She bent down and rested against the scorching wooden wall and pulled her to her side. Her arms found the knot of the towel and she loosened and easily took it off with a swift tug. Her heart was pulsating as she experienced her body being freed from the garment. The walls appeared to become closer, the air was heavy and suffocating with the scent of sweat and lust. They just remained there for a while, supporting each other's weight, heaving labored breaths. The passion of the situation was entrancing. None of them dared to utter a word. His eyes were glued to her as he attempted to comprehend the turn of events, but at the same time, his hands were on her again. Feeling her chest and arms, his caress was gentle and mockingly. He sighed lightly, his fingers gliding down his back. He noted her curved spine as if possessed by something. The desire that had been simmering between them for so long initially bubbled up. She pressed her lips to his neck, shivering, her fingertips on his hips, pulling him close, their bodies connected like one, as if they were whispering, not knowing if they were okay. Her voice a low and breathless sound. "Is that okay?" She leaned towards him. She couldn't say anything, she just looked at him with her eyes wide open. She smiled softly and then moved closer to give him another kiss. They were completely drenched on the bench, synchronizing their body movements with an instinctive stroke hotter than SAA. It made everything more real, their skin like silk. They gasped as they explored the other's body. Now their hands and mouths were in contact. Every touch and every kiss brought them closer together. Time passed quickly as they continued. Finally, the steam was gone from the connection between them deepened, as if the world beyond their small wooden room had vanished, leaving just the two of them lost in the moment. They slowed down hours later, their bodies tired but fulfilled. She put her head on his chest, their legs tangled together. The glow from their shared experience surrounded them as they rested on the bench. She hugged him close and stayed still. The quiet felt calming now, almost peaceful, he started to say, but he couldn't express it. She looked at him with soft, happy eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with satisfaction. They stayed there a long time, not talking, just enjoying being close to each other. This feeling lasted for ages. The stress had faded, replaced by a silent understanding. Above that sound, a bond at last. The girl stood up from her seat and held out a towel. "We should go. Get out of here before we recover from the heat." He said with a slight smile, smiled, and reached up to nod to take it himself. A towel. Yes, you're right. They got dressed in silence. Still, it wasn't uncomfortable, it wasn't sad, it was just a silent realization that something had changed between them when they left SAA and stepped into the cool air of the house. She looked at him, unsure of what to say. Not sure what to expect, but she smiled at him. Her eyes were gentle and warm. You said we'll find a way, as she read her thoughts, and she